Hello and welcome to Topic 4, Lecture 2, where we're going to do an overview of what you're going to be learning about in this chapter on civil liberties. So, what is the goal of this lecture? Well, there is a lot to learn about civil liberties, and the chapter is relatively long, and you're going to be learning a lot of cases. And there's no way that we can go over all of this in lecture, even though this lecture is going to be kind of longer than usual. And so the point of this lecture is to provide a guidepost for navigating these major themes in chapter 4. And so we're going to take a look at religion, speech, the right to privacy, and the rights of the criminally accused. That's what we're going to highlight in this lecture. And I teach a whole semester dedicated to civil liberties. And so if you are interested in this chapter and you're like, man, I want to learn more, I really encourage you to take Paul 210 Civil Liberties that I offer in the spring semester. It's a great class. Now, before we get into taking a look at the specific categories of civil liberties, I want to start with the idea of civil liberties and the balancing of interests. Just because you have personal freedoms that are granted to you in the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean that there aren't limits on these liberties. There are indeed limits. Freedom in a democracy is not unfettered. You can't do whatever you want. And I want you to think back to a couple of lectures ago when we were talking about Thomas Hobbes and the state of nature. Remember, the state of nature was the place where there was no government. And one of the kind of cool things about the state of nature is that because there was no government, you could do whatever you wanted. You had maximum liberty. But as Thomas Hobbes saw, that there was a clear downside to that. Living in a world that has no limits on people exercising their freedoms and their liberties can be really dangerous. If people can do whatever they want and government has no control over them, as Thomas Hobbes said, that living in that place would be not a great place. He said that a world like that would be nasty, brutish, and short. Because unfettered liberty can lead to disorder and it can harm others. And so that's why the state has an obligation to protect the public from harm. And so that while you as an individual and people have rights to protest, to bear arms, to speak, to exercise your right to privacy, that when you are exercising those liberties, that you could actually harm others in the community. And if that happens when you're exercising your freedoms and your exercise of those freedoms is harming others in the community or preventing others from being able to exercise their own liberties and their own freedoms, that's when the state steps in, okay? And so the state's well within their rights to curtail your speech or your right to bear arms or, any of the liberties if what you're doing is harming the community and others. And so that's why when you're learning about civil liberties, it's important to think about civil liberties as a balancing of interests, okay? On the one hand, an individual has the right to live freely, right? And in fact, all of those liberties, those freedoms, are outlined in the Bill of Rights. However, the state has an obligation to make sure that when you exercise your liberties, that you're not harming others. And also, if the way that you're exercising your freedoms is preventing the state from doing its job, then the state can step in and can limit and curtail your rights, okay? So it's a balancing of interests. Oftentimes you hear people say, oh, you live in the United States, you can do whatever you want. Like you have this ultimate freedom of choice, this ultimate freedom of how you want to live your life. And that's kind of an immature, undeveloped way of thinking about civil liberties. Yes, you do have these rights, but when your rights and your freedoms are harming others, that the state you should probably just control yourself, right? And have rights, but use them in a responsible manner. But if you don't do that, the state has an obligation to make sure that you are using and exercising your rights in a responsible way that's not harming others. So who determines that balance between the rights of the individual and the obligations of the state? It's the Supreme Court that determines that balance, right? It's the Supreme Court that says, hey, when the state is trying to curtail a person's rights, do they have the constitutional right to do that, right? And you'll see that in case after case where that a state or federal law will come into question and you'll say, hey, that law is infringing upon my ability to exercise my religious beliefs or whatever it might be. And then the Supreme Court is the one who determines that proper balance. So in all the cases that you're going to be learning about in this chapter, keep this balancing of interests in mind. Okay, so let's start with the First Amendment. And as we know, there are, magic pen, there are 5 liberties that are outlined in the First Amendment. And so let's just take a look at it and read it. The First Amendment, as we know, says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedoms of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so we have religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And all of that is included in the Bill of Rights, in the First Amendment. And so let's start with the very first liberty that's outlined in there, not speech, not press, not the right to peaceably assemble. But let's start with religion. Okay, so let's talk about religious freedoms. So the First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And those 2 phrases make up 2 clauses that are associated with religious freedoms. The yellow refers to the Establishment Clause. And so when it says that Congress, and of course it's been incorporated to the states and cities, so states and cities can't do this either. But when it says that they shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, basically what that means is that individuals have freedom from the state imposing any particular religion, okay? And we're going to be talking about sort of like what does that actually mean, right? I mean, at the most simplest level, it means that the national government or the state government couldn't declare like Catholicism as the national religion. But what actually constitutes an establishment of religion is not as obvious as like declaring a national religion, X, right? And we'll look at what the details of that are in a moment. But bottom line is that's the Establishment Clause, that individuals have freedom from the state imposing any particular religion upon them. And then the Free Exercise Clause is that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so what that means is that individuals have the freedom to practice their religion of choice without state interference, okay? And again, I want to remind you of that balancing interest. When you say without state interest, it doesn't mean that that you can practice your religion without any limits at all, right? That there are times when if you practice your religion, it's harming others, the state's going to step in and curtail your exercise. But in general, it's the freedom to practice religion of your choice without state interference. So let's dig into these a little bit more deeply. But first, let's ask, what were the goals of the religious clauses? You'll notice that religion is the first of the liberties that is listed in the First Amendment. And so let's talk a little bit about why that's the case and what were some of the goals that James Madison and the first Congress wanted to achieve by with their clauses having to do with religious freedoms. Okay, so what are the goals of the religious clauses? Why are they included in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights? Well, one reason or one goal of the religious clauses is to reduce conflict. And so, that as many of us know, that, the colonies and the original states, that there was a high presence of religion in the United States as there is still today. But what may be lesser known is that there were lots of different religious sects that were a part of the colonies and the original states. And so that while the vast majority, not all, but the vast majority of people who lived in the colonies and the early states were Christian, that there were lots of different sects of Christianity within the 13 states. And so, for example, Maryland Catholic, Pennsylvania Quaker, Virginia Anglican, some of the southern states, south of Virginia, were Baptist. Okay, and so there was there was a thinking that and there was a presence of conflict between different religious groups. Some religious groups were persecuted, and so the thinking is that you wanted to have in our Constitution that the state's not going to basically endorse one religion over the other, and that everybody has this right to exercise their religion. And if you have those sorts of freedoms, the hope was that it was going to reduce conflict, and also subsequently to provide protection for out-group religions. That it's a level playing field. The government isn't getting involved in endorsing one religion over another, and so maybe out-group religions, because they're aren't having to compete with state-supported religions, can actually get more adherents. And so there was a sense of wanting to provide those protections for those religious groups that weren't in the mainstream. And another goal of the religious clauses was to provide the freedom to worship and to not worship. The thinking is that your religious beliefs are really so important to your identity, whether you have religious beliefs or you don't have religious beliefs. And the government shouldn't get involved in that, what your conscience is, what your values are, these really important questions that we ask ourselves as humans, like what's the meaning of life, what happens to us after death, right? And so they wanted to make sure government wasn't involved in that, because that's such an important aspect of what it means to be human. There's a consequence of the religious clauses that we see in the United States that sort of makes the United States different, because we have this relatively strict separation of church and state. For one, that because the state wasn't involved in endorsing one religion over another, that the religion didn't get sullied by sort of the dirty side of politics, right? It was outside of that. Not that it didn't have its own problems at times, but it didn't get compounded by being affiliated with the government. And that led to, sort of a higher level of religiosity in the United States. That because government wasn't involved and it was more of a private endeavor, people remained adherents to religion, right? And didn't turn away from religion because religion got sort of wrapped up in the dirty side of politics. And so in the United States, when you look at the United States compared to countries like France and England and in Spain and even Italy, right, then we have a much higher level of religiosity. That we report having strong religious feelings, beliefs, praying daily, believing in God. And a lot of people think that has to do with the religious clauses. There's also a high amount of religious pluralism in the United States. Since the government didn't get in the business of endorsing or like putting down one religion over another, then it was like a marketplace of religious ideas. And that religions were springing up, like Mormonism is from the United States, right? And because they were competing for adherence, for people to come and we have the best religious ideas, come join us. And so we have a lot of religious pluralism in the United States, and a lot of that was supported by these religious clauses. So when we think about the Establishment Clause, we oftentimes think about the phrase separation of church and state. And the Establishment Clause is sort of establishing the separation between church and state. But that phrase is not in the Constitution. In fact, it came from a letter from Thomas Jefferson that he wrote to a group of Baptists, the Danbury Baptists. And it was there that he, talked about this wall that separates church and state. So that's where it comes from. So when we talk about the separation of church and state, when we talk about the Establishment Clause, what are we talking about? So the Establishment Clause forbids establishing a national religion. The Establishment Clause also forbids aiding one religion over another. And so government can't give tax breaks to one religion and not to another. They'd have to give it to all religions. It also forbids advancing or inhibiting religion. So any laws that are in place that advance religion, give aid to religion, that wouldn't be allowed. It also cannot take active measures to, tamp down a particular religious perspective. And at the end of the day, government needs to, sorry, my dog's in the way, government needs to be neutral when it comes to religion. That when the primary purpose of a law has to have a secular, non-religious purpose. And that expressing, that's how you would sort of look at, laws that have anything to do with religion. That the main purpose of the law has to be secular. Now, the question that we have when it comes to the Establishment Clause is, okay, so you have a wall separating church and state. just how tall and strong is that wall? Is it a big brick wall, like where church and state can't mingle at all? Or is it like a lower, more porous wall where there can be some mingling between church and state? Well, when it comes to public education in the United States, the Supreme Court has been pretty clear about what the wall looks like, and that there's a very, very strong and tall wall separating church from public education. And so that when it comes to school prayer, teaching religious curriculum, posting 10 commandments outside of like the principal's office, all of that is, none of that is allowed. Teaching creationism in a high school biology class, all of that is seen as violating the Establishment Clause. Now you could have a world religion class that like teaches about all different religions, but you can't have like I was raised Catholic, so you can't have like religious catechism class in a public school. You'll read about the Lemon Test that the Supreme Court has developed. It gives guidance to the state in order that when they are making laws that influence schools, there's a clear guidance that the Lemon Test to make sure that there's not this intermingling between church and state. And so the reason that the Supreme Court has been really strict is that children are impressionable, right? And that they should be getting their religious training or their lack of no religious training from their parents, not from the state through the public school. Now, in other instances, the wall between church and state is a lot lower and more porous, and intermingling between church and state is allowed, as long as it's not overtly advancing religion or overtly sort of aiding one religion over another. And you'll read about those cases in the textbook. And so the Supreme Court has allowed religious displays in the public square as long as non-religious groups can put a display there as well. And so during the holidays, you could have, a menorah for Jewish faith. You could have the crash with the baby Jesus in the manger. You could have the Festivus pole, right, from Seinfeld, which is a secular holiday, I guess. That's allowed. That putting in God we trust on currency has been deemed as not a violation of the Establishment Clause. That was added onto our currency during the Cold War in the 1950s, and it was seen as having a primarily secular, non-denominational intent. And non-denominational prayers to start sessions of Congress or to city meetings as well. All of that has been viewed as not a violation of the Establishment Clause. So hopefully that gives you a nice overview of that, and you'll be learning more specifically about that in the chapter. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at the Free Exercise Clause. And so while the Establishment Clause is basically more of an instruction to the state, telling the state what they can't do in relationship to the church, the Free Exercise Clause is more of an individual freedom. It's basically saying that people can believe and practice whatever religion they choose to believe and practice. And so it does have an implication for the state, because the state can't tell you you can't believe certain things, and it can't tell you that you can't practice your religion of choice, although we're going to see that there are some limitations on that in a moment. Also, that there's no consequence for not having a religious belief. So that establishing a religious oath of office, you'll see in the body of the Constitution, that is one of the limitations that is specifically stated on the state, that you can't make somebody take a religious oath of office, like swear their allegiance to a particular God or a particular religion before they can be sworn into public office. That's forbidden in the United States because it's a violation of both the Establishment Clause, but the Free Exercise Clause, because it's the state trying to tell you if you don't believe this, there's going to be a consequence for that, and that's not allowed. Now, I do want you to keep in mind that just as we were talking about at the beginning of the lecture about this balance, okay, between the individual and the state, there's this thing called the belief-action distinction. You can believe anything about religion, okay? Your religious belief is absolutely protected. What you believe, okay? You can believe that you need to sacrifice 20 goats and eat, strychnine or something in order to, be ascended up into heaven. You can believe that. But once you start practicing that, like slaughtering a bunch of goats or slaughtering a bunch of people or whatever your religious belief is telling you, right? It's once you put it into practice, that's where the state can step in. So religious belief is absolutely protected, but it's when religious practice, you put your beliefs into action, religious practice can be restricted if government shows a compelling reason for that restriction, okay? So you're going to be reading a lot of cases about the free exercise clause and when the government can and cannot step in to restrict the practice of your religion. Here's a good example of that. There was a case, now it was probably 10 plus years ago up in the Wausau area. But there was a family who had a daughter who had epilepsy and other conditions, might have been diabetes. I can't remember the condition that she had. But she would have these seizures and, kind of go into, some sort of diabetic shock. And the family was really religious and they chose to not take the child to the ER, but just to pray for her because their religious beliefs were like God's will be done, right? Well, they failed to take their daughter to the emergency room, and as a response, the daughter died. She didn't get the care that she needed, and they were charged with that crime. And their argument was, no, we're practicing our religious beliefs, and those religious beliefs are protected. And the Supreme Court, says no, that's not the case, and it's not a viable defense that you can use in a courtroom. And the reason is because the religious beliefs were being placed upon a child, and that the state has a compelling interest to protect the life of kids, right? Because they can't drive themselves to the ER, right? Now, if you as an adult want to deny yourself medical treatment because of your religious beliefs, you can do that, right? The state doesn't have a compelling interest to interfere with the actions and behaviors of adults. But they do when it comes to children because children are vulnerable. So that's a good example of one of the kinds of instances where the state might step in and will step in when your practice of religion is harming others. Okay, let's turn our sights now to looking at freedom of speech. So the first thing I want to talk about is that speech includes all forms of communication. And so oftentimes when we think about speech, we might think about what comes out of our mouths, sort of verbal communication. But when we think about the way the court has defined freedom of speech, speech includes things more than the spoken word. The written word, works of art, plays, music, all of that would be encompassed in the concept of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech also includes communicating ideas without words, and that's what's known as symbolic speech. And so symbolic speech is actions that communicate ideas, okay? And so like wearing an armband or burning a flag or burning a draft card, all of those are examples of symbolic speech. And depending on the circumstances of that symbolic speech, it does and can receive First Amendment protections. The other thing I wanted to mention is that when we talk about the First Amendment and freedom of speech, that freedom of speech concerns the government's effort to censor speech. So remember that when we're talking about the Bill of Rights, it's the thou shall nots on government, okay? It's telling government what they can't do. It's saying that government can't abridge your speech. Now, if a non-governmental entity wants to abridge your speech, it can do that. The First Amendment doesn't apply to private organizations. And so, for example, Facebook, Twitter, that you don't have First Amendment rights on Facebook and Twitter. If Twitter wants to end your account, suspend your account, they can do that because there are rules that you agree to become a member of Twitter. And if you violate those rules, then they can kick you off the site, kick you off the platform. And so keep in mind that when we're talking about freedom of speech and First Amendment rights to speak freely, we're talking about the government's efforts to curtail your speech, not a private entity like Facebook or Twitter. Now, the Supreme Court there's lots of different types of speech, right? And the Supreme Court gives the highest protections to what's known as political speech. And what political speech is speech that's designed to communicate an idea, okay, or communicate a value that a person might have. And so anytime speech is used to communicate some sort of idea that deals with a political or a social, a circumstance, that is considered political speech. And so political speech might be something obvious, like campaigning for a certain candidate, but it could also be promoting and supporting a certain a public policy. You could say that you're against abortion, or you're for abortion, you're against same-sex marriage, you're for same-sex marriage. It could be even something like the earth is flat, right? All of that is trying to communicate some sort of idea that you're trying to persuade people of. And the court gives the highest level of protection to speech that's trying to communicate ideas. And that includes even hateful and offensive political speech. That receives First Amendment protection from the Supreme Court. And you're going to be reading the case Snyder v. Phelps, which is about the Westboro Baptist Church and the protesting that they do against same-sex marriage, against gay rights, and against the U.S. military, because the U.S. military allows gay and lesbian folks and trans folks to openly serve in the military. And Westboro Baptist Church doesn't like that. And so Snyder v. Phelps is a case that examines whether or not the Westboro Baptist Church, whether their speech is protected by the First Amendment, and it is. And you'll read about that in the textbook. So why does political speech receive such high protection from the Supreme Court, high protection from the First Amendment? It makes it very difficult to curtail speech. The reason is because the Supreme Court, and I think it's widely sort of viewed, that you can't have a democracy without a free exchange of ideas. And so the government should be really reluctant to censor speech. The idea is that in a democracy, all viewpoints should be allowed to see the light of day. And that way we can come closer to truth. That way, when we're actually making decisions about who we want to elect or the policies that we want to support, we can do that through a competition of ideas. And the thinking is that the best, most truthful ideas will win out. And even if you do have something that's hateful and offensive, if you censor that, it just kind of goes underground, and you don't really get an opportunity to respond to the hate and demonstrate why it's hateful and harmful. And so, the Supreme Court, really supports political speech because they think you can't live in a democracy without it. Now, some speech is outside of First Amendment protections. Not all speech is even considered speech by the Supreme Court, because speech is supposed to communicate ideas. And so if some sort of form of communication presents a clear and present danger, and you're going to be reading about that in the case Brandenburg v. Ohio, which is about a Ku Klux Klan rally. They're saying in this is that if speech is likely to present an imminent harm to the community, then the government can step in and shut that speech down, okay, to prevent the greater, the speech needs to be protected, but when that speech is going to harm people, it needs to be shut down. And so speech that presents a clear and present danger can be censored. Also, certain words that are designed just to start a fight, they're called fighting words. Criminal speech, such as criminal conspiracy to kill somebody, harassment, pornography. You'll be reading about those in the chapter. All of those fall outside of First Amendment protections. Okay, the next liberty that we're going to talk about is the right to privacy. Now, the right to privacy is more than just the Fourth Amendment. And you're going to be reading about the Fourth Amendment in the textbook. We're not going to talk about it in lecture. But what the Fourth Amendment says is that you have a right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, and that if the government wants to search you, they have to have probable cause, and usually they have to have a warrant to do that search. That's what the Fourth Amendment is about. It's about police searches. It's about the government searching you for evidence of a crime. The right to privacy is more than just the Fourth Amendment. The right to privacy is this broader concept that means you have the right to be left alone by government. That there are certain aspects of your life, of your body, of your home, Any place where there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, that you have a right to be left alone, and government has to have a really good reason to enter into that zone of privacy. Now, when we think about the right to privacy, we're not just thinking about police searches. The right to privacy governs a much bigger sort of spectrum of issues. It governs the issues of private matters. And often when we think about the right to privacy, we're talking about body matters, like what goes on with your body and you having a right to privacy over your body. And so the right to privacy has to do with whether or not the government can prohibit you from using birth control. Sounds like, hey, why would they do that? But until the 1960s, they actually had laws in the books saying that you couldn't use birth control. They were actually seen as being like pornographic like items that the government, they thought they were immoral, and the government had power to prohibit you from using them. And so it governs issues having to do with whether you have a right to use birth control, whether you have a right to an abortion, what kind of a consenting adult sex you can engage in, whether you have a right to get married, and whether you have a right to end your life, the right to die. All of those are issues that you're going to be reading about in your textbook regarding the right to privacy. So again, it's more than just a police search. The interesting thing about the right to privacy is that it's not specifically enumerated in the Constitution. There's no amendment where you're going to find the words that Congress shall make no law abridging your right to privacy. It's not in the Constitution. However, it's derived from parts of the Bill of Rights, okay? And it's also derived from the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, okay? So you'll read about this in the textbook, that initially the right to privacy was said to come from the penumbras, the shadows that we find in the Constitution. So if you take like the First Amendment, the Third Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Ninth Amendment, you take those together, you find the right to privacy. Others have said you just find it in the Ninth Amendment, because remember the Ninth Amendment says just because it's not enumerated that you have the right doesn't mean that it's not a right that's afforded to people in our country. You do have that. But where we find it today is in the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and also the Due Process Clause of the 5th Amendment, that basically says that the federal government and the states can't take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of clause. And this right to privacy is seen as one of those key liberties. It's a source of controversy. Some of the justices on the Supreme Court today think that there is no right to guarantee for the right to privacy in the Constitution. There's the question about whether the Constitution provides protection over these matters. And in particular, the right to an abortion as it relates to the right to privacy is of high, it's a high source of controversy. These are the cases that you should be looking at in the textbook. Griswold, Roe, Lawrence, Obergefell. All of those are right to privacy cases. So as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, that there is a lot to cover in the Bill of Rights and civil liberties, and we're not going to get through it all in lecture. So the last thing we're going to talk about is due process, the rights of the criminally accused. And like I said, I'd be more than happy to cut during office hours or any other time. If you want to go into these in a little bit more detail, I'd be more than happy to do it. So nearly 40% of the Bill of Rights is dedicated to the rights of the criminally accused. You've got the 4th, the 5th, the 6th, and the 8th Amendment are really all amendments having to do with those who are accused of crimes, or also like the searching that can go on by the government in order to like demonstrate that you actually have committed a crime. And so there's a lot included in each of those. I will leave it to you to read it in the textbook about it. But these amendments basically outline the grants of the rights that are granted to those who are accused of crime. Whether that's the rights that you have in terms of the police searching you, whether the rights you have at the moment of arrest, that you have a right to remain silent, and also during trial you have a right to remain silent. The rights that are granted to you during trial. And then the 8th Amendment, that the rights, the government is limited in terms of the ways that it can punish you as well. And so like it says there, 40% of the Bill of Rights is dedicated to the rights of those accused. Why is that? Well, as I tell my criminal justice students, it's because the state is mighty and the individual, particularly those who are accused of crimes, are weak. And that in order to level the playing field, that the state has a lot of resources at its disposal in terms of prosecuting crime, and they should. It's a really important aspect of the state to make sure that order is kept and those who engage in harmful acts, that they're punished. So the state has a lot of resources to do that: law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, correctional facilities. But the Bill of Rights makes it so that those who are accused of crime, they have kind of a level playing field, right? They have to be told why they're being charged with the crime. Habeas corpus rights. They have to be given a fair jury trial, right? That they can't be forced to confess or forced to testify themselves at trial. And then when you punish people, you can't punish them in a cruel and unusual manner. So all of these liberties from the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th are all designed to sort of level the playing field. So that when in our democracy somebody is charged and then convicted and sentenced of a crime, because of these liberties, we have more confidence that the person who is in fact convicted and sentenced was in fact guilty of the crime that the state charged them with. I know this is a long lecture. Thank you, but there's a lot to cover. So thanks a lot for sticking with it. I appreciate it. Talk to you later.